Thank you for tuning in to our annual reporting orientation. This will be a guide to help you through whether it's your first year um, or maybe your second year or third year, help you through this annual reporting time. Today we're going to be going over the annual report requirements. This is broken up into 4 different segments. We have your applicant information, so just the general information about your report. And then we also have the summary of the annual net conservation benefits contribution. So what kind of conservation you've been able to accomplish over the past year. The summary of the effectiveness monitoring conducted, so what you found while conducting monitoring, and lastly, what your upcoming year annual forecast will look like. And then at the end, we'll also have a demo of the annual reporting tool. So why are we asking for an annual report? This report is your opportunity to let us know what you were able to accomplish over the past year, to see how well these conservation measures are working in terms of conducting the monitoring, and see what next year will bring. It's a way for you to summarize any supplemental conservation measures and provide the documentation needed to ensure us that you're implementing the requirements of the Monarch CCAA correctly. We do have a couple references to what is required in the CCAA itself. So please refer to section 14.1, where it talks more about the compliance tracking and reporting, and also section 9.2, where it discusses about how to modify your certificate of inclusions. But we'll also walk through what those requirements are during this recording. So who needs to prepare an annual report? So if you are enrolled in the Monarch CCAA and you've received your final certificate of inclusion before the end of the year, you are required to submit an annual report. So that would mean that your certificate of inclusion is signed both by you and the university. That indicates that you are fully enrolled. Those reports are due by the end of January 31st every year. Then UIC will prepare and submit to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service a combined annual report based on each of your specific annual reports. So even if your CI was finalized late in the year, and that didn't allow for you to fully implement or conduct monitoring, you're still required to submit an annual report. It will just be whatever you were able to accomplish over the past year, even given the limited time. Some important points to remember. Annual reports are how we primarily learn and know about what you are doing to stay in compliance for the Monarch CCAA and highlight any unique things you encountered over the past year, any circumstances that may have inhibited your ability to implement the program. And the online reporting tool, which is linked on the toolkit, is required for all partners to use to help streamline the report reviews. So that is how you'll be primarily submitting your annual report. The first section, the applicant information, this will be your basic information. It's your organization name, your contact information, your certificate of inclusion number, your enrolled lands from the past year, and what your adopted acres target was, as well as how many actual acres you were able to conduct conservation measures on. So this information you could find from from your certificate of inclusion primarily, but also the acres you contributed over the past year. You'll find that through whatever method you're using to track that. The next section would be the summary of your annual net conservation benefit contribution, what kind of conservation measures you were able to conduct over the past year, how many acres each of those measures were conducted on. So we're looking for a quantified and narrative summary of those adopted acres contributed. We also have a compliance tracking sheet. It is an Excel file, but if you have some other methods, we could potentially also consider those. So you'll be submitting on that Excel sheet the conservation measures, how many acres, where they're located, and we're also looking for a short narrative describing those conservation measures. If you had any unforeseen issues that impacted your contribution or the conservation measures you were planning to implement, and also any supplemental conservation measures that were applied. You can get discounts through these measures, supplemental conservation measures, which I'll go into more detail later. So this information you can find either on your tracking data sheet, internal reporting, however you're tracking this information. Maybe you have some treatment records or other maintenance records or project data. So you'll be pulling this information mainly from the method that you're using to track these. The compliance tracking template, like I mentioned, is on the toolkit. So this QR code will bring you to that. And then I'll also just quickly show you what the toolkit looks like. So if you follow that QR code, you should get to our toolkit here. So there's a lot of really great resources here. This is probably where you found the application and how you prepared your application documents before enrolling into the Monarch CCAA. For annual reporting, this will be the tab that will be of most use to you. Here we have the modification form. There's this annual reporting checklist, which could be helpful, making sure that you have everything ready to submit. Here's a template of the tool itself. So if you want to use this to start preparing your narrative, you can. Here's that compliance tracking template that I mentioned as well. And then the other thing you'll need to submit besides the compliance tracking template is the effectiveness monitoring template, which Dan will go into more detail later. So this is the toolkit, a lot of great resources. Also some resources for monitoring that I want to highlight as well. One aspect of annual reporting is addressing partner overlap in adopted acres. So for a program level, we need to know what adopted acres are overlapping with other partners. This does not affect your overall adopted acres target. You would still be considered to have met it, even if there is some overlap. This is just something us as a program we need to know so that we can track it and subtract it on a program level. So partners are expected to determine and know where there are overlapping acres with other partners, and we have some tools and some suggestions to help you through that. It's acceptable for partners to report the same overlapping acres, like I mentioned, but it should be reported if you determine there is some overlap. So to determine this, you would be coordinating with the other partners that operate in your area or in your state. This could be something that's high level. If certain counties, you both operate in and are both considering those your adopted acres and doing conservation measures in those counties, that could be fine as something to report. You could share GIS files and overlay where each other's adopted acres are. There is a section in the Monarch CCA that goes into more detail on overlapping acres in section 14.1.1 if you wanted to read more about it. The main tool that you can use to determine who else is operating in your state, we do have this Partners by State tool, which you can find on the toolkit as well. So if you open that up, you'll select what states you're operating in, and then it'll give you a list of current organizations that are in those states and their contact information. And so you'll work to contact those organizations and determine what kind of overlap there potentially could be operating in the same areas as you. Something that I mentioned is the supplemental conservation measure efforts. So you can receive discounts for these different supplemental measures. There is a table 6.5 in the CCA agreement itself for further details on this. So we do have 5 different supplemental measures, each with their own percentage off that you could receive. And you need to submit these documents to us during annual reporting time in order to receive those requirements. So, for example, if you wanted to receive the invasive species prevention best management practices, you would need to provide to us either some sort of documentation or provide a narrative that addresses what sort of invasive species best management practices you are conducting on those adopted acres, and then confirming with that those best management practices are being conducted on at least 50% of the targeted adopted acres. So if you provided that to us and that's something that you did over the past year, we would take a look at that and determine if you're able to receive the discount or not. So these are the 5 different supplemental measures here, and then their deduction percentage here. So if you're using the fee calculator, you can play around with that to see how addressing these different supplemental measures, how that affects your annual fee. So check that out. And if you have any questions on this, there is a guidance that also provides examples on the toolkit. So that should help you make sure that you're able to receive these discounts if you're interested. And with that, I will turn it over to Dan to talk about effectiveness monitoring conducted.
Great. Thank you, Megan. Yeah, so aside from the compliance tracking of those conservation measures and your adopted acres, the other large, sort of portion of the annual report is reporting on the monitoring that was conducted over the course of that year. So what we're looking for in the monitoring is a quantified and then a narrative summary of the monitoring that was conducted and the results that you found from that data collected. So you'll see in the reporting tool that we're looking for the upload of your data set. So there's as Megan pointed out in the toolkit, there is a template Excel sheet for the format that we'd like to see that data come in. We'd also like, along with that, data or information or a map that identifies where those sample locations occurred. So if you have, say, like latitude, longitude included within the data that you're submitting, that's sufficient. If you don't, having a map of where those samplings occurred would also be acceptable. Along with that, we also want to have a short narrative in the report itself that talks about the methods used, making sure you're complying with the sampling methodology that's in the CCAA, but then also confirming the results that you've seen. If you use the tool that's available in the toolkit, it will calculate some of the results towards the monitoring targets automatically. And so that allows it to be easily sort of summarized then not only in your tracking data, but also in your narrative. If you conducted any supplemental monitoring, that would be part of those supplemental measures that Megan was just talking about. So if you're using the Tier 2 or Tier 3 Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group scorecard, that would be examples of supplemental monitoring. Or if you collected additional data above and beyond sort of the baseline requirement, that would suffice as well. So talk about and share what that was, how you did that, and how you complied with those minimum requirements for that supplemental measure. Of course, we hear from a lot that going out in the field, actually sampling on adopted acres brings a lot of insights. And so either from just the data analysis itself or from the observations you had while monitoring, including some lessons learned from that effort is always, I think, helpful to include in the report. And then also, if you've happened to trigger those adaptive management thresholds, and we'll talk about these here shortly, we want you to consider why those were triggered and how you might consider adaptation to those. So the information that you need to provide all that is found, again, from the data that you've collected within your monitoring data. If you're sampling using the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group's Geospatial Habitat Database and the Survey 123 forms that are included in that, you'll have that data automatically sort of uploaded and then analyzed for your reporting. Again, if you're putting that data then from your own internal data records or systems into the Excel summary tool, that will also calculate those thresholds and summaries for you as well. Go to the next slide. We've talked about this template and results calculator. So as I mentioned, that is available on the toolkit as well. If you go under the toolkit, under monitoring, you'll see it come up there as the effectiveness monitoring template and CCAA results monitoring calculator. Next page. So a little bit on adaptive management. This is an area that we often see questions around. And this is also, again, built into that calculator. Within the CCAA, we have certain targets that we're trying to achieve in terms of milkweed and nectar plant cover, depending on which part of the country that your adopted acres are located in. And so we have in that table on the left, you'll see, depending on the CCAA region, and you can refer to the CCAA for the boundaries of these regions, but we have per acre targets of 156 stems of milkweed within the Midwest and East, and the South and West, at least 58 stems of milkweed or greater than 10% cover of nectar plants. And so you can see in that last column how that, essentially what's the equivalent of that on a per plot basis. Remember, when you're doing monitoring, that's a 1,500 square foot plot. So that is the resulting sort of stems per acre you're generally looking for in your sampling. And so as then shown as on the right, you are entering all that information into your monitoring summary. That then can get plugged into the results portion, which is shown in the lower right there. And those results then automatically are tied back to these STEM targets that we're trying to achieve. And so there's different options, different entries, depending on if you're in that Midwest and East region or the South and the West region. So the important thing to remember is that when you're actually taking stem counts or percent cover, right, that allows you to then use this confidence interval trigger for adaptive management, as opposed to the standard one if you're just taking sort of a yes, no, resources are present above or beyond the target. So a little bit more on that if you go to the next slide. As a reminder, there is sort of the minimum data requirement where you're simply stating, yes, no, you have the milkweed target or the nectar plant target in that individual plot. So it's a very bare minimum data collection. Of course, we really encourage you to take more and more beneficial data when you're out there. And so if you're actually counting stems or if you're actually estimating percent cover, that unlocks the lower 90% confidence interval adaptive management threshold. And so what that does is, and again, this is built into not only the geospatial database, but also the calculator that we've been talking about. It builds in the sort of basic statistics on the data set that you've collected. And it looks at, based on the amount of milkweed and nectar plants that you've identified in those monitoring plots, what falls within that 90% confidence interval range. So in other words, at what amount can we be 90% sure that we will see on the adopted acres based on the monitoring conducted? And so we're looking at the lower end of that range to see if that lower end is above those threshold targets. So if you're in the Midwest and East, we're looking for that lower end to be over 6 stems per acre. If you're in the South or West, we're looking for that to be over 2 stems per acre. And so, that's, again, a very helpful target because that way, naturally, with natural variability or just differences in site conditions and your random sampling of plots, it's very likely that you're not going to see milkweed in every single plot. And so you might have an abundance in some and no milkweed in others. This is a way that you can sort of look at that data set in aggregate and consider the full results of what you've collected out there. Go to the next slide. I do want to highlight just one additional consideration that is new as of 2023. Within the Midwest and East region, the program has worked with the Fish and Wildlife Service to provide some additional recognition beyond what was originally in the CCAA for the contribution of nectar plant cover within the Midwest and East region. So in the CCAA is approved, and with the biological opinion, the focus in the Midwest and East is really on achieving that milkweed stem target. And in the first few years of the program, we've seen that there is a lot of benefits and abundance of nectar plants as well that provide really important resources during migration, during the adult phase of monarchs as they're migrating, up north and also back south. And so we do have some guidance and an addendum regarding this within the toolkit, which includes this graphic here. But essentially what this means is that if you don't achieve your milkweed target in the Midwest and East, you have up to 3 years to achieve that target. And if after 3 years you're still not meeting that target, that's when adaptive management is triggered. So we're essentially recognizing that if you're not meeting milkweed, but you are achieving the nectar plant requirement, or target, I should say, then you don't need to adapt for up to 3 years. So it's still worth considering on an annual basis why you hadn't met those targets. We encourage you to still include that information in your reporting. But again, we're really happy that this recognition of nectar plants can be included and considered in your reports. Next slide. So just in sort of summary with adaptive management, again, don't be overly concerned about that. If you don't meet the targets within your monitoring, it doesn't mean that you're not in compliance. It just means that we want to try to get there eventually with some of the extra conservation commitments that you're providing through this program. And so we want you in the reporting to think about that and consider why were those targets not achieved? Was it a matter of where the random plots were sampled? Was it the time of year? Was it the number of plots didn't capture that? Or are there land management aspects that we need to consider that we can maybe affect or change in the future? And so we want you to think about that too. What are the changes or improvements that can be made either through your monitoring approach or through the management of those adopted acres to enhance and encourage milkweed and nectar plants for future years? So consider that. Again, we're looking for just a really short narrative and consideration of that in your annual report. Okay, next slide. One question we've occasionally had come up is, what if we're unable to complete any or all monitoring in 2023? This especially happens if you have a CI that was approved later on in the year. If you have already been enrolled and for some reason you weren't able to complete monitoring, that is something that we want you to describe and discuss why that implementation deviated from your planned implementation. Note sort of the extent or why monitoring wasn't conducted. So, if you were able to conduct some but not all, we want to know why that was the case. And then we also want to know then, well, what do you need to do to get back and achieve those requirements? That is, the monitoring that you're conducting is itself, the active monitoring is part of the compliance of the agreement. So we do want to see that being conducted. We do want to see that data being reported. And so we want you to address why that may have not occurred and why you're getting back into it. I do want to note, if you have a CI that is approved after August 1st each year, that we're considering is late in the season, that it's difficult to mobilize. We understand that it's difficult to monitor if you have a CI that was approved later on in the year. And so understandably, we expect some of those early enrollments late in the year not to include monitoring. We're really looking at monitoring in those first full years, or if your CI is approved, again, prior to August 1st. Next slide. And so with the last part of the report is looking ahead. So looking ahead at your upcoming year's annual forecast. What do you plan on conducting? Will your enrollment or your implementation change? This is a point in your report where you can tell us, are you going to keep on continuing with your commitments as is, or are there things that you're looking to change? This is also where if there are updates to your enrollment, say you're removing acres or adding acres, we want to sort of have a heads up there. And then any changes beyond that we want to see put within your CI modification form. So we have an image of that here. Again, that's on the toolkit, and that's a requirement for any changes that you have in your certificate of inclusion. And so depending on the scale of that change, the extent of that change, you might have to provide additional information. So look at that form for reference on what is expected and what you'll need to provide. But again, in the annual report, just having a heads up on what you expect to happen is helpful for us to know as a program. All right, with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Megan.
Thanks, Dan. So in summary, this is what we consider the annual reporting checklist. So you can use this as a guide to make sure that you're hitting all the requirements and you've gathered all that's necessary to submit a complete annual reporting package. This checklist can also be found on the Monarch CCAA toolkit as well. And as a last thing that we'll go over with you, I'll just demo what the tool itself for submitting your annual report looks like. So one thing I do want to note is this is something that we update from year to year. So depending on when you are looking and reviewing this, this training, it could vary slightly. So in order to sign in to the tool itself, each main contact of the organization will be receiving a username and password in order to get into the tool itself. And so this way you're able to share it with other people that you also want to help you complete your annual report. You can share it with consultants or other people in your organization. So the first page here is that basic information. I do believe that this is self-populating for what was submitted. So if any of this information should be changed, you can simply update it here. One thing to note is the certificate of inclusion number is case sensitive. So make sure that you're putting that in all caps and exactly as it appears on your certificate of inclusion form. This will indicate certain checks and balances we have throughout the annual report. So after you've completed your basic information, we'll go to the next page here. And this is where you'll fill out what your acres enrolled were for that year and what your target acres were. We do have a check here just to let you know what our records are. So if those differ from what you've entered, make sure that you're putting some additional information below on why there is that discrepancy. So you'll enter in your enrolled acres, your target acres, and then what was actually contributed for that year. And then any additional narrative you need to provide on this section. This is the annual net benefit conservation information. So you'll indicate which of the conservation measures you had completed for that year. This is where you can upload any sort of additional documents that you'd like to submit. Primarily, this is for the compliance tracking spreadsheet, but if there's other documents, you are able to upload multiple. We have other sections for you to input some narrative on how your conservation measures were implemented over the past year. So if any changes occurred, if any overlap occurred between you and another CCAA partner, if you had done any supplemental measures for that year, this is where you would indicate that. Any sort of detail, and then any necessary documentation for those supplemental measures. Just to reiterate, when we are calculating your admin fee, we look at the latest annual reporting documents that were submitted in the narrative for those supplemental measure discounts. So if you did not submit those, that's not something we would consider. So make sure you are submitting those with your annual report if you're interested in receiving those discounts. If you had updated any of your Section 7 information or AMMs, indicate that here, and then upload your latest Section 7 documentation. On the summary of the effectiveness monitoring conducted, there's a section to put a narrative about how monitoring was conducted over the past year, any sort of methods or where it was conducted. You know, again, tell a story of what happened over the past year so that we have an idea of how you've been implementing the program. This is where you'll upload your map. So a map showing where these different monitoring locations are, a summary of your results, any sort of future recommendations that you'll potentially be implementing. Here you'll upload your effectiveness monitoring, and I'll also mention that there is a link to the toolkit for any sort of table or document that's needed during these different sections. So we do try to make this as easy as possible. If any adaptive management was triggered, you'll indicate that here. And if you anticipate any sort of actions that go along with that, again, just because you trigger it once doesn't mean that we have to put a plan together. If it's triggered after several years, then we'll work with you to put a plan together. But if you have any general adaptive management actions that you're planning on taking, please summarize those here. If you did any supplemental monitoring, this would be a good place to indicate, you know, what that was, if you use a certain scorecard, things along those lines. And then what your upcoming year forecast looks like. So if you're planning on making any sort of changes to your certificate of inclusion, please indicate that here. So if you're changing the main contact, if you're increasing the amount of enrolled acres, even if you're planning on expanding how many adopted acres you're contributing, we would like to know that. Any general comments about how this past year's implementation went, or this annual reporting tool? We're always looking to update this and consider your feedback. So this is where you can also provide any sort of updates you would like to see made to this tool or the annual reporting process, so that we can continuously improve how this goes for our partners. Any additional supporting documentations you want to provide, that can be uploaded here. And as I mentioned, you can upload several documents. So anything you want to provide to us, this was kind of your final shot here for that. And then if you had filled this out, this is where the summary would be of everything that you had entered and indicated. Here, there's a couple different ways that you can get a copy of this report once you're done. So you can use this print option if you want a screenshot of all the pages. You can also download a CSV version of this. And then also, when you press done, it'll indicate if you're missing anything. So I did not fill this out, so that's why all of these sections are looking incomplete. But once you click submit, there's actually also a way for those that are not the main contact to also receive a copy of the report. So you can add different emails here. You can add multiple emails. If you want other people in your organization or other consultants or other people to receive a copy of that. So that's one other way for other people to receive a copy. So once that is sent, you should see the screen here that thanks you for your submission, and you should be receiving an email shortly with the summary of everything you submitted. So yeah, thank you for listening in on this annual reporting orientation. We do usually hold a couple help desks around this time and give reminders during the monthly Monarch CCAA meetings. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to anyone on the team, and we're happy to talk through any questions you have on your annual report. Dan, is there anything you want to add before we end the recording?
No, there's a lot to cover there. So I just, I guess maybe encourage people to reach out with any questions if they have them as they develop that. We're there and available to help anytime.
Okay, thank you, and good luck on annual reporting.